Hello, everyone. Welcome to this panel of the Journalism in the Time of Crisis conference. Our panel is titled Local Matters, and it's described this way. Local news publishers and journalists are essential sources of trusted information for COVID-19. How has the pandemic impacted local journalism? To help us illuminate this subject, and I'm sure others in a related vein, I would like to welcome the following folks. Mark Glazer is a consultant and advisor with a focus on supporting local and independent news in America. He's joining us from Santa Fe today. He was the founder and executive director of MediaShift.org. He's an associate at Dot Connector Studio and innovation consultant at the New Mexico Local News Fund. He is a longtime freelance journalist, and from 2001 to 2005, he wrote a weekly column for USC Annenberg School of Communications Online Journalism Review. And this summer, he was the author of a significant I would say research essay called 3 Ways Local News Initiatives Are Serving Crucial COVID-19 Information to People in News Deserts in the United States. April Lindgren is a professor at the Ryerson School of Journalism and is the Velma Rogers Research Chair and Principal Investigator for the Local News Research Project. Her current research is on local news poverty, and working with colleagues from University of British Columbia and Royal Roads University, she spearheaded the creation of the Local News Map. Also joining us is Patricia Elliott. She's a freelance magazine journalist and alternative media practitioner, as well as a faculty member of the School of Journalism at the University of Regina. She has been cited numerous times by the Canadian Association of Journalists and National Magazine Awards for outstanding investigative journalism. Welcome to you three, and welcome to all of those out there who I can't see who may be listening. We also may be joined by Willie Palov. He's a sports reporter with the Halifax Chronicle Herald. He's the president as well of the Halifax Typographical Union. He's also on the CWA Canada National Executive, and he's been a reporter in at the Halifax paper for 25 years. He is, I believe, in the middle of a working day in a working newsroom, and so he may have to fit us around that schedule, but we're hoping that he'll be able to join us as well. So, clearly, the pandemic arrived at a time when all news organizations were already facing severe challenges, financial challenges, technological challenges, and others. As a result, primarily of the collapse of the traditional advertising market in the news business, the proliferation as well of innumerable digital news competitors, which has its bright spots and its drawbacks for traditional legacy news organizations, of course, and a number of other forces that have been undermining a long-standing economic model for the news business. Professor Lindgren here in Canada has been leading the documenting of this local news desert phenomenon. Again, Mark is going to be able to bring us some insights about that in the United States. The news company Saltwire's shutdown of so many of Atlantic Canada's community newspapers this year due to the added economic strain of COVID-19 is just one symbol of how the pandemic has been like a double whammy for many news organizations, not just in Canada, but also in the US, the UK, and beyond. We also heard this morning in a keynote address from Julie Possetti, the Global Director of Research with the International Center for Journalists, about how profoundly the pandemic has been affecting the mental health of journalists around the world, stoked, in fact, by anxiety about challenging working conditions and potential job losses. And we know that those pressures are felt at media organizations large and small. At the same time, credible news sources, especially at the local level, given the variable, localized nature of the pandemic's severity, have necessarily played or should have played a vital role in keeping citizens informed about public health risks and COVID-19 containment guidelines. Local and regional news operations, where they continue to function effectively, have no doubt been indispensable for government and health officials in helping to spread awareness among the general public of how not to spread the coronavirus, what government supports have been made available, and so forth. And of course, where does a community gather, even if it's only in digital space, to learn about the loss of longtime community members, the courage and sacrifices of frontline workers, the special hardships faced by businesses, educators, and the vulnerable? It's community news sources who are bringing those stories and those struggles to life. So that's the framing of this. I'm sure that that's a bit of a downer in the way that I've framed the discussion, but I'm happy to know that there's going to be some uplifting perspectives conveyed over the course of our discussion, which will follow. And Willie, I'm very glad that you've been able to join us. And so what I'll do, hi Willie.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Oh,
I was punching in the wrong code, so I figured it out eventually. I was seeing numbers and letters, but anyway, I'm here now.
We're very glad to have you. And so I think what I'll do is I'll ask April, perhaps, if you don't mind, to take it away with some opening observations, maybe help set the stage for our discussion. April Lindgren.
Okay, thank you so much, Randy, and it's great to be with everybody. I thought I would try to put some sort of take a quantitative snapshot of what's been happening in Canada as the pandemic, with the onset of the pandemic, and then put that into a broader context of what's been happening to local journalism over time. So I've just got a few slides I'll share. I think people can, I hope, see this.
Coming through loud and clear.
Great. So, so after the declaration of the global pandemic in March 11th, on March 11th, and the lockdown of local businesses, we started to see, of course, waves of announcements of layoffs and pay cuts and closings that are supposed to be temporary or permanent. And it was clear something out of the ordinary was happening. And so along with the Canadian Association of Journalists and JSource, we created the COVID-19 media impact map for Canada. So the map tracks closings, as you can see here, closings, layoffs, pay cuts, various types of service reductions. And we also started a spreadsheet where we've been tracking temporary and permanent layoff announcements. So this tracks all types of media, both local and national, but the reality impacts are on local news organizations. So I drew on my experience with making the local news map, and that allowed us to build the COVID map relatively quickly once we decided to do it. When it launched on April 29th, we had 5 weeks worth of data since the onset of the pandemic. And since then, we've been doing occasional updates and producing fact sheets and publishing the full sets of data as we acquire enough new information. So the most recent update was posted yesterday. And as you can see from this example, each of the markers on the map is accompanied by a description of what happened, the location, media type, language of operation, and all of that data is available along with the summary fact sheets that we publish whenever we do an update. We also provide, as you'll see at the bottom of this slide, links with each marker so that people know what our sources of information are. So on this last update, which we just did yesterday, published yesterday, we added 37 markers. So I was sort of discouraged by that, as you might expect. Some of them are recent developments, but in other cases, actually, we were only able to verify and add information about decisions that had been made earlier in the pandemic. So it's not necessarily 37 terrible things that have happened since mid-August when we did the last update, although there's a fair bit of that, I have to admit. So since the pandemic was declared on March 11th, this is just a snapshot of some of the data. 51 news organizations have closed or temporarily closed. Almost all of them have been community newspapers that publish fewer than 5 times a week. So 24 of them, in fact, are community papers that have permanently closed, and along with 2 private radio stations. 141 news organizations have announced layoffs of editorial and non-editorial employees, and it's important to know that both the numbers reflect both groups of workers. That number is, I'm sure, low. And I say that because one of the challenges has been that quite a few of the larger companies have announced cuts, but they have not been very forthcoming at all about which of their broadcast outlets or digital properties or newspapers have on the ground have experienced the cuts, and whether and certainly they've been less than forthcoming as well about whether those cuts are in the newsrooms or in advertising and other back office operations. So the total we have right now is that 2,553 workers, again, editorial and non-editorial, have been laid off for at least some time since March 11th. And of those, we've identified 810 permanent layoffs. So in many cases, we don't know if those temporary layoffs are going to, the rest of them, we don't know if they're going to turn into permanent job losses. And in some cases, people have been rehired. And when that happens, we update the information that is displayed with the marker on the map. This is just another way of looking at the data. It's a bit of a summary. And again, as you can see from the first row, most of the carnage has been in the community newspaper sector, where you can see 30 have canceled, in addition to 48 closing or 48 closed or temporarily closed. And again, half of those are permanently closed. 30 have canceled some print editions, cut back, reduced coverage in other ways, had layoffs or pay cuts. Now it's important to know that, some places have had reduced coverage, layoffs, and pay cuts. So there's some double counting of what's going on in there. But this gives you just an idea of what's been happening on a media type section. As you can see, daily newspapers, the second category, have also not escaped unscathed. 12 have canceled, some or all their print editions. So I just wanted to spend a few minutes to put those pandemic effects into the broader context, and that broader context, of course, being the challenges that local media have been encountering for quite some time now. And so to do that, I'm going to refer to this other map that we run called the Local News Map, and it's been tracking changes to local news organizations dating back to 2008. So what you can see here is a summary of some of the data that appears on the map. So when we did our most recent update on October 1st, we documented 341 closings of local radio, TV, and newspaper and online sites. And again, as you can see from here, it's the community newspaper sector that has been really hard hit again. Those we define as papers that publish fewer than 5 times a week. I just wanted to provide some comparison for that. So we also track on this map what's launched in terms of new operations. And there's about, we have 130 of them since 2008, or about a third as many as have closed. So we published updates. We launched the map. We actually launched this map in 2016, and then we've been looking. We went into the past to collect data since 2008, and we publish updates and fact sheets every 2 months. And we've been doing that for some time. So recently, I've been trying to do some more with the data. I've had a bit of time to put the data in context, and one result of that was recently we started including this chart with the bi-monthly reports. So as you can see, here we are in 2020. There's a few months to go in the year, and we we know that for sure there's at least 24 news outlets that have been temporarily closed. And I really hope we're not going to see them join this column in the longer run, but we don't know that yet. And then for this presentation, I was interested to answer the question of where are news organizations closing based on our data. So basically I wanted to get a sense of the pattern of losses and gains in smaller versus larger centers. So here we know that all of the closings that have happened since 2008 have occurred in 240 different places across the country. And so we mapped them by census subdivisions, excuse me, which is more or less by municipality. So the larger the dot, the more losses of local media have occurred in those locations. So you get a sense of a lot of dots and a lot of small dots outside of the major cities. And I just wanted you to be able to compare that to our dots that are located in where new operations have been launching. So we know that 95 places have been home to the launch of a new media outlet, local media outlet since 2008. So we did do some breakouts to sort of get a visual sense of what's happening. So this is the greater, the Golden Horseshoe area down around Toronto. And you can see Toronto and certainly see that it's not just in Toronto where there have been a lot of losses, but a lot of the smaller communities in the area. And similarly for Ottawa, this is Ottawa and Montreal we're showing here in this little bit of a breakout map. So I didn't, given the time available, I obviously didn't want to have to show detailed maps for every region of the country. So instead, we just prepared this chart, which I think tells the story in a more concise way. So if you look at the bigger cities like Montreal, Ottawa, and Toronto, 15 to 20 of them, each of them have lost 15 to 20 local news operations since 2008, and there haven't been all that many startups to compensate. But I think the number that I'm now this list also includes some smaller cities, but the number that interests me particularly as well is this line here at the bottom that tells us that 233 places outside of these major metropolitan areas have all lost a local news outlet. And so the question obviously is, well, what's left? And I think that's where we're headed in the future, to try and define, find out, does that mean they're left with nothing? Or does that mean there's still a paper left in the community? Is there still local radio and local television? What has been the impact of the loss, in most cases, of a community newspaper? Because we know that's what's been closing. So I'm just going to stop there and turn it back to you, Randy.
Okay, thank you, April. That's a rapid and pretty sobering overview of the situation. I guess I probably didn't introduce myself at the outset, so I'll just mention for the record that I'm Randy Boswell. I'm a professor of journalism at Carleton University and a longtime newspaper reporter in Ottawa. Okay, thanks again, April. Patricia, can I ask you to weigh in with some introductory remarks?
Sure. So as the topic is local matters, I'm going to speak from like a really local and specific context, which is Saskatchewan, because I thought that's something I could add that might not be covered elsewhere. So we're a province with relatively small urban centers and significant rural and northern population. The distances are great, and so local reporting greatly matters. Yeah. To date, the COVID cases here have been relatively low, but they're climbing. We've so far had just over 2,500 cases in the province and 25 deaths. But the need for information to keep those numbers down has placed a really heavy burden on already reduced newsrooms. And then complicating matters is the health authorities' reluctance to provide detailed information to journalists. While they do release the names of locations where an infected person has been, the general case reporting is described only in very wide geographic areas like Northwest or Southeast. And in Saskatchewan, these are huge areas. So this leaves people to glean what's happening around them by putting together Facebook posts. And across the province, people are endlessly and anxiously scrolling social media feeds for anything they can find. I mean, I figure among that as well. And among those posts lurks misinformation and disinformation, and this is really dangerous. So in my hometown of Estevan, which is a community of 10,000 people, I don't remember a single street demonstration in all my years growing up there. But now these are regular occurrences taking place on the courthouse steps and fueled by pseudoscience found on social media about masks and vaccines, and by much darker accompanying narratives about global conspiracies headed by the UN and the WHO, which aim to enslave us all. And then even in the annual rodeo parade, like among the horses and the clowns, I was shocked to see a float warning people about these conspiracies. So more disturbing, I have seen calls to arms on my hometown social media and people answering that they are ready. And I mean, this is Saskatchewan. People do have guns here. So this is how people are responding to the pandemic in a growing news desert, with fear, with suspicion, and with anger. And the journalists we have are doing their absolute best. They're clocking a lot of overtime hours, but they're up against a huge tide of alternative information sources, much of it really sketchy. And then further, they are expected to cover provincial and municipal elections in the midst of a second wave. And it's just impossible. So other issues like school board and city council meetings were already ghosts among our main media outlets, but now they're even fainter ghosts. So to give a lay of the land, there's like 58 members of the Sask Weekly Newspapers Association. Right now, we've lost 14 weeklies in the past decade. That's relying on April's map, mostly in small towns. I live in Regina, which is served by a Post Media Daily that is integrated very closely with the Post Media Saskatoon Daily, with really declined local content over the past decade. CBC English is primarily regional in focus, and the French language side, RDI, still invests a lot in local stories, but with a smaller audience. So, and we've got some commercial radio. We have a shoestring, alt weekly, community access cable, and community radio. And I just want to draw some attention to the last two. A lot of local political information has defaulted to community cable volunteers, including live coverage of City Hall, candidate debates during elections, candidate videos, and live election night coverage. And likewise, community radio, which is staffed by volunteers, is pulling more than its fair share. For example, providing special children's programming during the lockdown. Their advertising has dried up, being dependent heavily on small shops, restaurants, and music venues, which have been closed. And the hosts have had to work from home, but without any bank of proper equipment to draw on. And this matters a lot because CJTR broadcasts in 9 languages. They're the only outlet equipped to reach non-English and non-French speakers with vital information. And they are doing it on the strength of volunteers and fundraising drives. Another bright spot, though, is Saskatchewan has a really robust Indigenous community radio sphere with 66 stations serving First Nations and surrounding communities. These stations are particularly important in the north, where other media services are few. And they provide programming in several Cree and Dene dialects, as well as Saulteaux, Lakota, Michif, and of course, English and French. Their reach and language abilities have made them key frontline players. However, they're not well supported. A 2019 Canadian Commission for UNESCO investigation found the Indigenous broadcasting sector receives only a few small scattered federal grants for individual stations, they described it as short-term unstable funding. And so beyond projects funding for individual stations, there's no sector-wide support. And that same report found 100% of stations are in a vulnerable position, with a third labeled severely or critically endangered. The federal government, meanwhile, has prepared COVID-19 public service announcements in 21 Indigenous languages, and they're counting on Indigenous community radio, but not adequately supporting it. Myself and my colleague Shannon Avison at the First Nations University of Canada are involved in a project called Intergenerational Learning for Indigenous Language Broadcasting. And Shannon reports that every station she's in regular contact with indicates serious challenges with staffing. And it matters because although Saskatchewan is just 3% of Canada's Indigenous population, we're home to nearly 20% of Indigenous language speakers. and Indigenous people comprise 15% of our population.
Mm.
Indigenous communities moved very fast to contain the virus, much faster than the municipal governments did. But nonetheless, they have had a higher death rate, with 54% of recorded deaths in the first wave, despite representing just 22% of population. And so to keep these isolated populations safe, community radio is a lifeline, providing advice and countering rumors that COVID is not a serious threat outside urban areas. There are some micro grants that Community Radio Fund of Canada offers, but that very name micro grant ensures it's not a long-term solution, as noted by the UNESCO task force. Through the Cactus, the community media sector was able to gain access to a portion of local journalism initiative funding. And with LGI funding, Mississippi Broadcasting Corp in Saskatchewan got support for one local journalist, which has helped, but the journalist also has so many other issues to cover, all of them equally or more pressing during the pandemic, such as missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, youth suicide, rising racism, contaminated water, and ongoing struggles for sovereignty, to name a few that the journalist is expected to cover. So there's already been discussion about commercial media today, and I'm not taking away from their work. My intent was just to ensure that non-commercial radio is also front and center for their ability to reach specific audiences deserving specialized coverage. The pandemic has revealed a critical need for this kind of journalism, including the community-based Indigenous, Northern, and ethnic reporting. They've largely been overlooked at decision-making tables and largely excluded from discussions of funding support. So I think in closing, all Canadians owe them a huge debt, and the Canadian government needs to take a closer look at the health of this sector before issuing more public service announcements for them to convey. Thanks.
Wow. Okay. Thank you for that. Boy, you guys must have compared notes ahead of time. April gave us this wonderful helicopter view of the nation and the problems. Patricia, that's a great zoom in on Saskatchewan and the incredible array of issues that arise. Much more complex, some ways troubling, several ways troubling, I should say, than I imagined. So thank you for that. I know there will be some echoes there too. I know for you, Mark, who I'm going to ask to speak next, about some of the ways that communities are trying, I guess, in difficult circumstances to find solutions. But Mark, please give us your overview.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me on the panel. And it's nice to be joining my colleagues up north from here in the US and in Santa Fe. I think that we all have a good idea of the challenges for traditional media, for print media in the digital age. And I've been, tracking that for a number of years. And my focus has always been on who's doing the right things, who's doing the innovations, who's figuring out the solutions to all these problems. And so when I look at what's going on and all the problems that are happening, especially exacerbated with COVID, I think it really comes down to what Patricia was mentioning, which is community first. Look at the community that's being affected, by being in a news desert, by having challenges of news and information. The newspaper chains that own a lot of these papers, they don't care about the communities. They aren't in the communities. They're in the US, a lot of them are now owned by hedge funds who only care about stripping those newspapers and making them into ghost newspapers. Each community has unique information needs, a unique audience, unique demographics. To find a solution for that, for each community, it's sometimes the audience. If the audience is comprised of people who have a good amount of money, then it requires asking them to subscribe, become a member, become a donor. If the audience does not have as much means, then sometimes it means getting grant support or other collaborations that can help kind of fill the gap. And the local businesses in the area are also key. Who are the local businesses that serve that community, and how can they help in supporting local news and information in that community. We're somewhat lucky in the US having the Knight Foundation, who I've done some work with, and I've got some grants from them. The Knight Foundation, which came out of a chain of newspapers in the US, and Google and Facebook, not the best actors out there either, but they've all pledged just about $1 billion to support local news over the next 5 years. And Knight Foundation in particular, knows that they don't have all the answers or all the money for everything. So their focus has been on bringing in local foundations, family foundations in each community. Who are the people who have the means, maybe even high net worth individuals who can come in and help support local news. Often they'll have a convening of all the key stakeholders in the community and say, let's talk about a topic like education, or let's talk about it, obviously now health and COVID, and let's figure out how can all the local outlets in that community support and cover that topic, and who would support that financially and make sure that they can cover this topic. I put together kind of a counter program to all the news deserts and problem maps that we've been tracking by doing this kind of civic bright spots map that I'll share, that I did with Dot Connector Studio for Knight Foundation, to basically show where are all of Knight's investments happening throughout the US. And luckily they were in all 50 states. And some of the places that are kind of a darker orange are these kind of bigger civic bright spots where there's collaborations happening. For instance, in Charlotte, North Carolina, there's a collaboration of different kinds of outlets, including ethnic media, TV, radio, print, and it's being run out of the public library in Charlotte. They're like the main hub there. In New Hampshire, they're doing COVID coverage in collaboration. In Detroit, they're using a community priorities model in their collaboration, where they're trying to find out from the community what are the needs there and how can they serve those needs. There's new collaborations happening in Wichita, Kansas, in Buffalo, in Cleveland, and other places, all driven by local funders, local foundations, and people who care about the community. And while foundations have a weird relationship with local news, they have their priorities just like any other sponsor or advertiser. They have to understand that when they give money to local news, there's going to be independence, there's going to be editorial independence, and they're going to cover what's important. And so a lot of them, it's a little bit of a learning curve to understand that. There's also been new models. April talked a little bit about the rise of these new publications that are coming up. A lot of them are digital first. In the US, we have the Institute for Nonprofit News and Lion Publishers. Lion's focused a little bit more on for-profit online publications. INN focused on nonprofit news. Those organizations are thriving right now. They've grown by leaps and bounds, and this year alone, they're now over 300 members each. And they give support to these new newsrooms that are cropping up, and ethnic media are now being included in those organizations. At Lion, they now have a new, with support from Google, they have this new lab to help kind of start up more publications in news deserts. INN has INN Springboard to help kind of launch new publications. And INN's also been involved in Newsmatch, which is a way for foundations, national and local foundations, to support nonprofit newsrooms around the country during a big drive from November 1st to the end of December, where when people donate to those publications, these foundations will match every donation. And then sometimes getting a local foundation, they'll get a triple match for each dollar they raise. Last year, I believe they brought in over $40 million. And this year, there's 267 publications that are going to be part of Newsmatch that launches about a week. There's also interesting movement by for-profits. The local media association in the US started a COVID fund where they helped for-profit publications get donations from their audience for the first time using a foundation and fiscal sponsor model. And with that drive, 225 publishers raised $1.6 million using that fund. And now they've launched a new Center for Journalism Funding with 6 publications to raise $2.25 million is their goal on a 6-month program, also supported by Google. Facebook has also started and just launched a sustainability accelerator for 20 newsrooms that are owned and run by people of color. They each get $100,000 for a 6-month program with coaches to help them out. And they'll, you know, sustainability is a part of that program. Not only will they get the money, but they'll also try to become sustainable. Hi. This is my son, Everett. I wanted to say hi.
Hello.
As usual, wearing some clothes. And so they're trying to do something too. Facebook has said they're going to be giving a $5 million investment into local news, and especially local news run by people of color. And finally, I just want to talk a little bit about in New Mexico, here where I am. I've been helping out the New Mexico Local News Fund with a revenue initiative here, where we've been helping grantees that are for-profit, nonprofit, radio, TV, to give them some help during COVID with the money that they've lost, but not only just giving them a grant, but also making sure they have a revenue plan in place for the long term and come up with new revenue streams. Some examples, Taos News newspaper got a grant from Lore Foundation that basically helped triple the power of advertisements from local businesses that advertise with the paper. So if they bought $100 worth of ads, they get $300. So it basically tripled the power of their ads. And that brought in over $30,000 for the publication. GPK Media, which is in small town of Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, they have a AM radio station and a newspaper. And they started live streaming funerals to help people out who couldn't go to funerals because of COVID. They're live streaming sports. They also have gotten an influx of ads from candidates during the political season. And so they decided to have, let the candidates get like a guest DJ spot for an hour where they could basically play their favorite music for an hour and pay for that. Here in Santa Fe, the Santa Fe New Mexicans started a new business around live streaming events and doing virtual events for people in the community. And they've already brought in over $50,000 in that new business that they literally just launched in the last few months. So, you know, there's a lot of different efforts out there, very creative efforts to survive. And I think it's going to take a mix of for-profit, nonprofit. There's even a co-op model a cooperative model that's being explored by various publications where the audience becomes part owners of the publication. There's all kinds of ways that people are trying to figure out new ways of surviving and being sustainable. So I do have some hope, even in these dark times, that there are some, you know, there's some bright spots out there.
Thank you, Mark. There was a lot of exhilarating information there and examples. And I know that those aren't necessarily going to replace the the livelihood industry, I guess, in the newspaper and legacy media world. But it's pretty encouraging that there's some solutions at least formulating through, and many of them, in fact. We could go on for some time, and that doesn't even include the 45 minutes I would love to spend just talking about a town called Truth or Consequences, which is just richly symbolic as well. Anyway, I'll move on. Thank you, Mark. We'll come back, I'm sure. Willie, I'd be very pleased for you to give us a sense of your perspective from Atlantic Canada.
Yeah, I had some questions about that Truth or Consequences town too. What a great name. So, and also Mark did sort of a lot of the same themes that he touched on spilled into the things I'm going to talk about. So, I'm going to work a little bit backwards and end up talking about COVID, only because I think a lot of the things that all journalists are working on and media companies. the COVID experience kind of made them more acute, at least in my experience here. So just by way of background, I am a sports reporter. I've been at this paper for 25 years, and we're almost 200 years old, the Chronicle Herald. And we have always, for a long time, and still are the largest independently owned paper in Canada. So we were lucky in the sense that we had one family that was directing us. And we've since become our own chain by way of acquisitions, but I'll circle back to that later. So, but a lot of what we talk about here all the time, just like you all are talking about, is how to keep the customers we already have, but how to also drive new customers, because the print model, we hear it all the time, is quote dying. We hit the older demographic buys papers. We need the kids and the millennials and everybody else. So when you're in a newsroom like I am, I think we always end up with a bias that we think journalism solves everything. So the way we looked at it here, and our management had their own ideas, was to get this transition, but not to transition to the web, that is, but not to lose our print subscribers, because the phrase they like to use is that's what keeps the lights on. So it's a fine balance, because like we're all talking about now, there are fewer resources to pay for journalism, photography, to hire ad sales reps, all those things that you need to keep the money coming in. So you have to be really selective about where you spend that money. But in the newsroom, we think you hire more good writers, more photographers, more everybody. And your focus, I think, doesn't change just because we're a legacy company. It doesn't change that what people still want is hard, reliable news. And when you start with that, you can also give informed perspective by way of columnists, even guest voices, politicians, whatever you want. So the danger, though, is the way we're seeing the web, particularly social media companies, driving information that's watered down and supposed to have a mass appeal. It doesn't really attract anybody. It doesn't keep them on your website, and it's mass produced. So there's nothing that connects people with whatever it is that's in those pieces. So what happened at our company, I'm not going to give a long history lesson, but I'll take it back to about almost 5 years ago now, is as I said, we were a long legacy print company, and management had decided in a lot of ways, justifiably, that they had to change that business model where they weren't investing as much in editors just for the purpose of paginating. So putting those stories physically onto the page and running them out, and they went to maybe outsource that with cheaper people, which was actually a good idea that we agreed with. But along with that thought process on their end came the idea that others can produce the rest of the product as cheaply, which means you can hire almost anybody to write. You can create photos and videos with people who may not have experience, let alone journalism training. So the balancing act, it started to, I think anyway, without criticizing my own employer too much, it swung a little too far the other way, where a lot of our product became a little bit watered down. And what we found is that you can do that for a little while, but in the long term, if it's like any business, if you're selling something that's a little bit of a lower quality, your committed customers will start to waver. And we're dealing with that now, because after we settled from the strike, again, justifiably, the message and the mandate was we need to push our resources more into locking down a reliable web base of readers. And we all agree that's really important. But because our staffing levels went from, we were, I think, 65 newsroom employees down to 25, everybody here can do math. That's going to make it tough to balance print priorities, web priorities, quality, all those things. And the worry inside the newsroom, probably because we are traditionalists, older people like myself with the miles I have on my resume, we worried that we would lose our older demographic, meaning people who, I'll use my own anecdotal explanations, would be 60 or above, often 70 or above, subscribing to our paper for simple things like obituaries, puzzles, crosswords. In the sports section, they would like to read the box scores. These aren't items that really translate well to the web, and they're not interested in consuming their product there anyway. So we definitely were behind the idea that we have to promote our website, and we also had to make sure we didn't have huge losses. So I won't skip too far ahead to that because there's other stuff I'll incorporate into there. But the second thing that happened while we were out on the strike, which was really technically more of a lockout, and we could have another panel discussion about the reasons that went into that and how all that went. But while we were out, our paper acquired 34 different media properties in Atlantic Canada from Transcontinental. So we went from this one stable source. We did have some weeklies, some free giveaway papers, but all of a sudden we then became the newspaper chain. So we have the next thing to a monopoly down here in Atlantic Canada. So which despite the circumstances and the timing of it, we are all pretty excited about. We went from I think it was about 300 employees at the Chronicle Herald to now a network that had around 700, and there were signs of steady revenue from all these smaller papers with traditional readerships and all those things. So that was a big positive. What we found was that the management of a network is challenging. We've all seen Post Media, Transcontinental, you name it. You have people who have their own ideas of what a big audience wants, and some of that's built into our management. And what I mean by that is all of a sudden, for example, let's take our paper, we have access to the content from 34 others. Well, the temptation is let's fill our pages and fill our website with stuff we've already paid for. And on paper, some of that makes sense. But what I would say is, if I circle back to what I mentioned at the start, which is that I think that content is the be all and end all. Well, every customer at every paper, at least in my biased estimation, wants something that's interesting to them. So they want, something as grassroots as a story about a small business in their small community, which is not interesting to someone who reads our paper in St. John's. And that's not to say that we are running a similar story out of St. John's in the Halifax paper, but I think you get the idea.
Willie,
yeah.
I'm just going to press pause for a moment, and then I'm going to come back to you, especially for the COVID impact. But I know that Patricia has to head off to a class shortly, and I just wanted her to get one more shot at responding, I guess, to some of the other things folks have said. So I will come back to you just after we give Patricia a chance to give some final thoughts, I guess, before you teach class. Thanks, Willie.
Yeah.
Patricia, do you want to pop in again?
Thank you, and sorry to interrupt. I have students waiting on me. I don't have a lot more to add. I would second the switch to online doesn't work in all cases. That's often a more urban solution. Doesn't work as well in rural areas or in the north where the internet connections just aren't strong enough. They don't have high-speed internet, and people's orientation is to radio in the north and to print in the rural areas, for those reasons. So, but I listened with interest. I am also very interested in seeing the development of cooperative models and non-commercial models. So that was great to hear some of that. And I'll just leave it at that, unless there's any questions people have. Or
No, and thank you again for joining us and providing that great perspective. And like I say, I think there really were some echoes and crossovers with particularly what Mark was talking about. So thank you very much for joining us, and have a good class.
thank you. Have a good rest of the session. It's really wonderful listening to everybody.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to just return to Willie, and you can pick up your narrative from where you left off. Thanks. And thanks for letting Patricia have that word.
Yeah, of course. So I'm almost at the COVID part, but going back to what I was saying, coming out of this long work stoppage here, our management continues to work on different revenue streams while we're out. And again, I raised this journalism bias again, because what we saw was a sort of an effort to take shortcuts with creating revenue by introducing a lot of sponsored content. People are paying for, a business story or those things. Now they were labeled and they were identified as not journalism necessarily, but our worry was that not everybody's going to understand or appreciate that these are coming from different sources, and especially if they are presented in an adjacent kind of way. They might not have been on the news site, but they're on parts of it. So all credit to trying to innovate and trying to find new ways to bring in money in different ways. But where we are right now, actually, no, let me backtrack. We're coming out of the COVID here. So as COVID hit, we, like I said, we're doing a lot of experimentation with different ways to raise money, different ways to lock down a younger audience, different ways to monetize the web. We introduced a hard paywall that, like all hard paywalls, had a good start and then leveled off and is quite gradual and incremental now. People don't like to have to pay for news when they've been getting it for free, but that's a 15 or 20-year-old problem that the genie was out of the bottle there. So it's kind of hard to go backwards. But just as we were sort of stabilizing into March, like a lot of us, we were hit here. And what happened, like a lot of places, was the ad revenue just dried up to the point of almost 90% losses. So that's because with especially the printed product, you're advertising, car dealerships or restaurants or Costco or places, retail outlets. You can't and would not advertise retail outlets that are all closed. So everybody hit the pause button, revenue flattened, and we had a 40% layoff across the network, temporary layoff. So like I said, we were at 700 employees at that time. And I think the number that came in was close to 300 of people put on temporary layoff. So the ones who stayed were all asked to survive on either 75 or 80% salary. So it was a really collective effort on everybody's part. The people who were on the CERB while they're waiting to see if the pandemic kind of lightened up, and also those people who are still working. So, everybody had to sacrifice. And then over time, we were lucky here in Atlantic, Canada, that we were able to get the virus under control quite a bit better than a lot of places in Canada, namely because of we don't have the population density of Toronto or Montreal. So, our cases were easy to trace, and we've been under 10 since, I want to say, probably early May. So it was at that time, and then into June, that of the 300 people laid off, I would estimate maybe about 25% of those came back, because some businesses were starting to open, the restrictions were lessening. And then as we got through into the summer, where we had kind of plateaued with our COVID management around Atlantic Canada, that only started our local economy really at the grassroots level. So we couldn't reintroduce our whole national engine or anything like that. And it was at that time that our company realized, well, that's not going to happen until COVID has a vaccine, and the whole world really gets back on track. So it was time at that stage to decide how many permanent layoffs to have. So the total number was close to 150 people out of 700 were laid off, and now we're moving forward. So what we learned during that time was all those old lessons I talked about, that people were relying on our paper, physical, printed product, but also the web for that really basic COVID information that everybody needed to know. How are the cases today? Our top web hits almost every day were, what's next for COVID, and that lasted through the first few months. Then by a sad and unfortunate coincidence, we had a long run of very dark news events happen here. We had the biggest mass shooting in Canadian history. We had 2 separate pilot incidents of people from here dying, which reinforced to us, unfortunately, in a kind of morbid way. And I will say, I hate this expression, but the old idiom that if it bleeds, it leads. Hard news, dark news, it drives our business. So it was a reminder, I think, to management and everybody that we really need to have as our baseline hard news. And then once we have the hard news, we need experienced commentary. We need experienced feature work. We noticed an increased demand for that. Our web engagement in those areas on long features went up. And that was around the same time that they brought me back, because I was off myself for 2.5 months. Sports were not being played, obviously. But we reached a point, just like a lot of places, that people, as much as they craved that hard news, had a little bit of COVID fatigue too. I need to think about something else, was the sentiment, right? So even though there weren't a lot of sports being played, and this extends out to our entertainment and lifestyles writers, feature writers, even our web and video producers, was that people needed more of a diversion. So there's a window there too, I think. If we're going to add to our product, people do like a more of a longer read. They do like, human interest stories and all those things. So the last thing that we learned was, particularly where we are all isolated, is we really need to excel at driving traffic through the web. And at my age, in 25 years, I'm probably not an expert on how to drive 20, a demographic in the early 20s to Instagram. We are trying that, but I think if people who own these companies are investing, it would be, I think, the lesson from COVID was that let's get them hooked on our product through those social media outlets, and then let's keep them by delivering day after day that hard news and that more in-depth stuff. So, which is all to say, if we had all the resources in the world, great, but we really have to hit our targets really precisely.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Willie. That was I mean, it was a great compliment, because I know a lot of what we talk about is big picture stuff and broad themes, and nothing is more visceral than someone who's in the thick of it and caught, in a sense, in the COVID layoffs, and but fighting to try and figure out a path forward. So thank you for taking us on that tour, for sure. Let me go back, April, to your thoughts about some of the other things that have been raised here, presented. There's so many issues that arise. This is, I mean, even here in Canada this week, we've had a major announcement from the News Media Council of the country, pressing the Canadian government to go after two of those organizations you mentioned, Facebook and Google. I'll just hold this up in front of my camera if I can. It's a newspaper ad from today. This isn't a David versus Goliath story. And they say it's actually two Davids. Sorry, it's David and two Goliaths. And of course, it's Google and Facebook that news publishers in Canada are attacking for sucking essentially all the profits out of the news business, and demanding that the Canadian government follow an Australian model for supporting journalism in Canada. Our federal government has actually committed hundreds of millions of dollars to financial aid, essentially, to the journalism industry. Lots of debates about exactly that, and whether it's a wise direction. So there's a lot of things happening in addition to the things we've raised here. And April, I just, I'll throw that out there and invite you to kind of bounce off of some of the things you're hearing.
Yeah, so even though I've spent a fair bit of time tracking what the problems are, I'm actually most interested these days in what solutions are. I think there's a few things that are happening that give us some hope. One is the change of rules that allow news organizations to get charitable status so that they can accept donations and issue tax receipts. We haven't had that. Our tax laws haven't allowed that until this spring. So I think that's opening up the potential for maybe more philanthropic support. And so one of the things I'm looking at is sort of what are models that have worked elsewhere, and what are the best practices that would work here to have the biggest bang for the buck. The other thing is I'm increasingly interested in the ideas of collaboration, and by that I mean collaboration between news organizations. If you've got three news organizations left in a medium-sized city and they're all struggling on a shoestring, the public interest, it seems to me, to be would be advanced by collaborative work, at least on some of the projects that they do, rather than the sort of old dog eat dog model where both of them are just sort of gnawing at bones anyway. So I think there's some potential there. And then I also think that increasingly journalism schools are starting to look at ways to play a role in supporting their communities, or at least some of the local news ecosystem in their communities, and beyond that. I know we certainly are. The Institute for Investigative Journalism out of Concordia has been doing extraordinary work. And I think that there's some potential there, which would be great for the students, and potentially for news organizations as well. But if I could I just had one question for Willie. I know that Saltwire had closed temporarily 21 of those weekly papers it had acquired. And I was just wondering what's happened with those. I thought are they still closed?
Not all of them. I wouldn't be able to tell you which ones. It's been in dribs and drabs, the reopenings. Okay. And some are, just as we were talking, actually, we get a weekly update every Friday about which way the revenues are going and things like that. So there might have been one coming in today, because last Friday they reintroduced two that I can remember. And I also know that, for example, PEI, they're still working through how to approach that market. Whether or not they should, there are two main papers there, the Charlottetown Guardian and the Summerside Journal Pioneer. And along with those big themes I was talking about whether we need to go hyper local or whether we can walk a line and combine coverage from papers that are at least nearby or close to each other. They're trying to decide what to do with the Summerside Journal Pioneer, whether they can move it over to a weekly and combine it with what they're offering through the Guardian. So it's a day-to-day thing, and I'm not even exaggerating, because most of the weeklies that we had created and some of the weeklies that we acquired weren't subscription based. It was all ad based. And so during COVID, of course, these are places you hand them out at malls and you have stores advertising, and that's how you generate them. So I don't have a latest list of which ones are back, but I know they feel like those are they're good vehicles for the whole network, really, because like I said, they're so grassroots. The content itself is fairly inexpensive to create. People aren't looking to those products for their hard-hitting news. They're looking for very, very community-based stories. So our hope is to just kind of tread water, and if we get all these reopenings full on again, then maybe there's going to be a relaunch, because although they are print products, and I know we're always fairly focused on the web side of things, I think there's still a good market for those papers. And I think, without putting words into our management's mouth, I think they feel the same way.
Okay. Thanks, Willie, and thanks, April. Mark, I want to swing back to you, and I'm going to read back to you something that you wrote this summer. You reviewed some of the kinds of information that April shared earlier about the closings, and that Willie's talking about too out in Eastern Canada. The situation, I'm quoting you, the situation for people in news deserts is dire, and even worse during a pandemic when timely information is a matter of life and death. And that's compounded, as you describe here, by COVID-19 test deserts, where it was actually difficult to keep track of the progress of the pandemic. But in fact, the piece you wrote for the Knight Foundation goes on then to describe things like texting services, and again, a number of the other, I would say, green shoots or bright spots that you see emerging from this, under the dark cloud of the other side of the story. Do you want to describe a few of the ones that you think are perhaps most exciting in terms of the ways that communities have responded to closures and a lack of community news businesses, and whether they are a prospect for sustainable journalism going forward, rather than just stopgap measures?
Yeah, I think that it was interesting doing this story, because I was initially told to go find someone who's has plenty of news sources, and then compare that to someone who's in a news desert and how bad it was for them. And I started going down that path. And as I did, I started to find what interested me more was how are projects actually trying to reach people in these places, and who's doing it well, and who is doing it in a sustainable way where it might be a potential business model that will work. I think texting is really interesting, because while Patricia had said, online websites, that doesn't always work for everyone. I think texting is something that, largely everyone has a cell phone and uses it pretty often. And so there have been these services like Ground Source, which is a way of reaching more people in communities through texting services, where a news organization will ask people to text in information about something or how they're experiencing something. And one of the ones that has an interesting business model is subtext, which basically it's a texting service where reporters directly will text paying subscribers. Usually it's about $5 a month to subscribe. And if it's there's a political reporter in San Francisco who's been using it. And for the people who really care about politics there, the real politicos and lobbyists and activists and all those people, that's really valuable information, probably worth more than even $5 a month, to be honest. And the reporter will send stuff to them in advance of their stories, talk about what they're working on. There's a way to respond and interact with the reporter. It's not like a discussion group. It's just one way, the reporter to the people, and the people can kind of discuss one-on-one with the reporter. So that's a really interesting one that I think has some potential. And then the other thing is around kind of what Patricia had mentioned, which is immigrant media and public access TV, which has existed for a long time and has been hit hard by COVID as well. But there have been bright spots out there with some of these, including, one in Hawaii that covers the island of Maui that had people out, really covering communities in ways that no one else really was. And again, can be volunteers in the community who are doing that. And it doesn't sound sustainable when you think about it, community radio, community media. But these are people who really care about the public. And there's a lot of interesting programs out there to train people to become kind of community journalists in a way. There's City Bureau that's in Chicago that's now their program, what they call Documenters program, where they have people go and cover, board meetings and things that, the media doesn't really cover as much in government, and they're expanding their service out to other cities in the US too. So it's interesting to see all these different efforts. I'm not going to say that they're going to replace everything we've lost with newspapers, but I think we have to really rethink who is providing us with news and information in obviously an accurate and trustworthy way, and how we're going to support that without thinking about the print is dead, TV, radio. Let's just think about, each community needs to figure out where is their audience, where does the audience get their information, and try to be there for that audience. If it's Instagram or Facebook or these places, they don't have a good reputation, but you can set up a private group on Facebook where you can make sure people are moderated and you can make sure the information is better. But I just think that it's not about the medium necessarily. It's about where is the community and how to serve them.
I just have a quick question. I'm notorious among my editors over the years of writing 275 word leads. And I'm just trying to figure out with texting, what's the expression model? Are they short blurps? How does it work?
Yeah, it's funny. I talked to some of the people who do it because I was curious about that too. Like, do you really want this big, long text, showing up at whatever 8 a.m, and so he said, it's really important to get to the point, say exactly what's going on, have a quick hit type of thing, get it done in a quick bullet points. So it's definitely a different kind of writing. Personally, I would feel like getting a text is such a personal medium. You're usually getting it from friends and family. And so I feel like it's a little bit invasive in a way. But now I think people really are getting used to getting commercial messages in their texting. And when they subscribe to something that's useful and valuable, you really have to make sure that those texts are relevant, they're important. You're not doing it too often. I think some of them try to do it just once a day, real short hits. That works. But it is a totally different way of communicating, and you have to be cognizant of that for sure.
Great. On the subject of green shoots and bright spots, April, you said that's something that you're, interested in as a counterpose, I guess, to the desert and poverty side of the equation. Are there particular ones, April, that you're seeing that strike you as perhaps the brightest of the bright spots? Ones where perhaps it's a different model of revenue generation, or a different concept of the way news is delivered, or maybe give us a sense of what stands out for you as a true bright spot in the horizon.
Well, I think one of the obvious ones for me is the collaboration between the journalism schools across the country, news media organizations, as part of the Institute for Investigative Journalism's big annual investigative projects. I mean, those the project that the J School students from the journalism schools and the collaborating news organizations did last year is nominated for a Michener Award in Public Service, and it was for a large project that looked at lead contamination in municipal drinking water systems, and the failure of municipal governments to be transparent about what those levels were. So I think that there is potential there. I mean, first of all, because investigative journalism is so challenged, particularly in small news organizations, which have experienced major newsroom cuts, and there's not the sort of leeway or the willingness to invest in reporters' time to do bigger projects, and certainly, so I think that to me is an example of a potential. We should be thinking along those lines and collaborations, certainly as schools of journalism, which would be great for our students, and it's great for the communities that benefit from this type of getting access to this kind of investigative reporting as well. So I would flag that one for sure.
I mentioned earlier the ongoing negotiation / implementation to some degree of government funding, essentially, or tax adjustments that will benefit major publishers, and other funding that will be directed towards local news initiatives. Is the government state-sponsored journalism option something that is discussed much in the United States, Mark? Is it something that interests you, Willie, as some way for Saltwire, for example, to shore up its enterprises, and April as well across the board for supporting journalism? I'll leave that open to the floor, but it's an ongoing subject in Canada.
Yeah,
I'll say. Oh, go ahead, Willie.
Okay, yeah, I won't be long. So what I'll say is, right as the pandemic was starting, was right when we were benefiting from the federal program to introduce new reporters into our newsroom. We got 2 reporters, and across our network there were 6 total who filled roles that wouldn't have otherwise been created, and created jobs for people who wouldn't otherwise have had them. So in our newsroom, we have 2 federally funded reporters. One of them covers health issues. We had lost our health reporter through layoff, and the other, they describe her role as a new people's reporter, which was mostly about immigration. And their young, hungry reporters have both done a really good job and have connected really well with our readers, to the point where I think we might even, in the 4 years, I'm also the union president, as I mentioned before, in the 3.5 years I've been in that role, we might actually have a new hire this week. So we're hoping that the new hire is one of these 2 new reporters. Okay. So what that tells me is it was a really fruitful way to introduce young journalists, into the industry, because at the risk of denigrating our union body, well, the people who have survived, like myself, have been around for 25 years, and I don't want to be an ageist, but I don't have the same ideas as a teenager or someone in their early 20s. Our demographics through layoffs, we came back and we only had 3 females left in our 25 person newsroom. It just was it was just the way it worked out. It wasn't by design. It was people taking buyouts. So it's, as we all know, it's really hard to infuse new people into newsrooms. And if the government's assistance in this particular program is doing that, I have evidence that it's working. And it's been a great resource to our paper. So props to our government for helping out that way.
Now, the government might want to know more about that situation for a forthcoming advertisement.
Yeah.
Mark, your thoughts about this issue?
Yeah, I mean, the US is far behind Canada and UK and so many other countries when it comes to public support and government support, you know, starting with public media downward. There have been a lot of calls by especially the legacy media to have this kind of government support for local media. And so far, I think New Jersey as a state has provided that, and little less than what they initially were planning to give, to create kind of a commission to help give out that money to different local media. I think that the focus on that support, at least in the US, should be on you know, independent media, independently owned media, community media, media run by people of color, underserved media, these news deserts. I mean, that's where I think that money should go. There's always a question when it comes to government money as to, you know, what are the strings that are attached to that? You know, what will you have to do? What will the government expect? Can the government just turn off that spigot at any moment? So like any other source of funding, I feel like it's maybe a piece of the puzzle. I think we've all been searching for this silver bullet, this solution that's going to solve everything. That's not going to exist. We're going to have to come up with a lot of different ideas and figure out what works, you know, in each community. And if there is a government that understands they need to support independent journalism, you know, that then I think that's great that the government supports it. And I think it's needed, obviously, right now. But I think this thought that government's going to come to the rescue, this white knight, and I think, you know, is misplaced. I think people think if Biden wins the election, there's a definite opportunity for this kind of support. And there was the small business program to support small businesses during COVID that did go to some local media. But I just think, you know, I think that's a little bit misplaced, that I don't think it's going to be the answer. It's going to be one of many answers, really.
Okay, thanks. I know, April, you mentioned earlier the adjustments in regulation or rules around philanthropic support for journalism. Do you see that, or in a sense, the tax changes and the other direct funding options as a significant, sustainable, I'm not going to say solution, but part solution to the problem?
Well, I would just reiterate Mark's point about there not being a silver bullet. I think there's going to be all these are pieces of a bigger puzzle that used to be filled by the advertising piece. Yeah. And so I think that yeah, I mean, there will be some philanthropic support, but if you look at the amount of just the size of the philanthropic sector in Canada relative to the amount of advertising that's disappeared over the last 10 years, you know, it's certainly, it's not going to be everything. Right. I mean, I think in terms of the government programs, I mean, I struggled with this, but then I thought, okay, look at all the other sectors that government subsidizes. And they don't do it because it makes, you know, perfect, beautiful economic sense. They do it for all sorts of political and policy and basic human quality of life issues. Yeah. And here we have journalism, which we know is a really important public good. And to stand on some sort of economic principle that, you know, it should survive on its own when it's clear the private sector clearly is failing to be able to do that. I've come around to the idea that, yeah, we need to have support for journalism, and we need to kind of hold our nose, do it, and put the controls in place. Now, I would also say, though, I think there's a real obligation on the part of news organizations to be transparent. So, Willie, I think it's great that Saltwire is getting 2 reporters from the Local Journalism Initiative, but they did just lay off 100+ people, and I'm wondering how many new jobs were laid off there, and so that's kind of smelly.
Yes.
In my view, and that's part of going to be. I mean, I can sort of have some sympathy for it because we're in extraordinary times with COVID, but I mean, there's a lot of news organizations that I think are being less than transparent about what they're doing in their newsrooms, some of whom may well be recipients of Local Journalism Initiative funding. I can maybe turn a blind eye to it because of where we are at this point in time with COVID, but down the road, I don't think that shouldn't be allowed to wash. I mean,
I agree. Yeah. Well, yeah, that became a separate dispute on our end here. As I said, in my role as the union president, out of our newsroom, we had 10 journalists on temporary layoff, and we had these 2 funded journalists still working. So it was a major dispute. We could fill another hour and a half with that. Now, I will say that fortunately, we were the one Saltwire network that brought everybody back to the newsroom. So we were really pleased with that. And I will say that of a lot of the layoffs, a lot of them were not in the journalism sphere, but we did definitely lose a lot of reporters and photographers and that kind of thing. So the priority, the message is at least that the priority was to maintain as much as you can anyway, the presence of actual working journalists, and that was good. And if we isolate, like you were saying, this issue as a COVID related blip, I'm okay with it. But you're right. I think long term, we can't lay people off to soften their payroll and drop new people in that are funded through different channels. It's not a great wash for long-term sustainability, especially if we're seeing people unfortunately laid off at a difficult age. People who would be 50 and have a hard time transitioning into another career. They're in that, like myself, they're in sort of the no man's land, if you want to call it that. So I don't want to see that. That's for sure. We'd like to see people get to the finish line, or we'd like to see people coming in at the start who can make it to the end through 35 or 40 years in the business. But again, we could spend 9 hours on that. So
I think we could spend 9 or more hours on it. So many of the issues that were raised today, but I see that I'm actually out of time for the panel, and it just happens to coincide with the moment when the sun is rising and blasting me here in Ottawa, which I'm sure is a good symbol of something. Anyway, there have been a lot of issues, and I know there are some dark clouds, but I am glad to hear that there are some bright spots, some green shoots, and some exciting ideas happening as well on the local news front. So I guess we'll maintain vigilance and hope for the best. Thank you all for participating in this panel. Obviously, when we're talking about the intersection of journalism and the pandemic, it doesn't, the rubber doesn't hit the road quite as clearly as it does at the local news environment. And so thank you for illuminating aspects of this issue for our audience and for an unknown audience to follow, because of course this will be this recording of our talk will be available, and this is probably going to lead to publications down the road where our conversation will have a further life. So again, thank you all for coming. Much appreciated, and have a great rest of the day.
Great. Thanks for inviting me.
Bye.
Okay. Bye.